we're going to imagine that we're kind of heading out to Point Lobos together. And we're going to bring a sketchbook, a notebook with us. So wherever I go out exploring, I bring a book with me that is filled with, this is where I record all the observations that I make. And the purpose of this is that my brain, just on its own, it can only hold at any one time just a little bit of information. So if I am trying to like, oh, remember, that's really cool about that bird, and I'm trying to remember that and have it stick in my head, that actually interferes with me both experiencing other things or being able to encode other stuff into my brain. And you actually have all had this same experience. If you run out of eggs and you start saying to yourself, okay, got to remember eggs, got to get eggs, 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 you're useless for the rest of the day. So what do? We write it down on a list, right? And everybody's got, in your kitchen, there is a list, and you're putting the things that you need to get when you get to the grocery store. And why do we do this? Because it works. So anything that you think of that you need to get, it goes on the list, and then you can do something productively with it later. And that's exactly what I do with nature observations. So if I am out in the field and I see some cool critter, I describe what I see, either its behavior or its plumage, whatever it's doing, whatever I notice, I record that. I get it out of here and onto here. And what that does is it allows me then to sort of free up more mental bandwidth to play with the next idea and not to completely forget all the other stuff that went before. And so then what I can do is I can look into this book and say like oh, this, here were notes and observations that I made about this. I can look back at this later, and it refreshes my brain in a way that's actually much more profound than if you take a photograph. Because in the process of doing this, I had to really pay attention. So the journal is a way of focusing my attention and preserving memories in a very, very powerful way. If you think you're just going to remember something, what we now know about memories is that memory doesn't work that way. When you are remembering something, you're kind of taking some information from the past and reworking it, layering in all sorts of new crazy details, and then that gets served up to your kind of conscious attention as this memory. And part of its stuff maybe is part of stuff that happened, and the other part is completely constructed, and your brain can't tell the difference between the two. So the more time passes, the more these memories sort of morph into each other. Or you might have like known somebody, you told them a story, and the next time you meet them, they're telling this story as if it happened to them. So they've taken your memory and incorporated it into their own personal narrative. That's just like the goofy stuff that memory does. But what the journal does is it allows me to have these really powerful memory anchors. And because I've documented it, those memories are not going to be able to morph and change in the same way, because I just glance back at the page and these things snap back to where they were. So there are three kind of critical languages to use in a journal like this. So one is drawing pictures. And it doesn't matter if you are an artist or not. The purpose of this is not to make pretty pictures. The purpose of this is just to focus our attention and to help us record things in a visual way. The way you think with pictures is just different than the way you think with words, which brings us to thing number two. We're going to record your observations with words. And then thing number three is numbers. So counting things, measuring things, estimating numbers of things. If you say there were a lot of birds there, is that 45 birds or is that 45,000 birds, right? So we want to also include those numbers. So the more you practice doing it, the better and better it gets. And if after the end of this little workshop, you go like, man, that would be fun to do. I want to do that on my next hike, but I'd like to have some more resources. I put in the chat my website, and I have hundreds of hours of free videos and free online tutorial material. And you can go check that stuff out. And also every week I'm teaching 3 workshops, 3 free online Zoom workshops, if you can handle more of this Zoom stuff, right? That where I teach people how to do this. So if you want to go to one of those drawing classes or journaling workshops, they're all a bunch of old ones recorded and 3 new ones made every week. And so you can check those out. If you, at the end of this workshop, you're thinking like, oh man, this nature journaling stuff is really, really cool, right? And that's so what I want to do now is just to get you really excited about it. We are going to go on a virtual nature journal ramble at Point Lobos together. And not only are we able to kind of do this together and not worry about spreading COVID, but we're also able to time travel because we're going to go there tomorrow morning. All right. So thank you for joining with me tomorrow morning. And what we're going to do is, now that we're here in the parking lot, is we're going to just take a walk out into an overlook here and explore around. We're going to see what we see, and we're going to use words, pictures, and numbers to document what we see onto a piece of paper. And I'll kind of show you kind of in the flow of it what this looks like. All right. So I am now going to jump over to my journal. There it is. Hello, journal. And what I do is I will tend to, if I have a notebook with me and it's buried somewhere in a backpack and hard to get to, very often I'll spend the entire day just walking around, and at the end of the day, I've never busted the journal out. So it's very helpful at the start of a day. And so here we are early in the morning. So this is January. Is tomorrow the 13th? I think it is. And I'm going to write 2021 because I'm just still not used to writing 2021. And we're at Point Lobos. Excited to be there, so it gets an exclamation point. And it is a foggy morning, so I'm going to draw in a little cloud and write foggy in it. So what I've done is, this is what's called metadata. This is sort of the information behind the information on a page. And as a scientist, I've trained myself that it's sort of like I've date stamped and geo-referenced this set of observations. So what that does is it turns whatever you put down on a page, it changes it just from being notes into data. And the scientist in me gets really, really excited about that. So now I'm going to walk down the trail. I hear, and here comes a flock of bush tits, and they're moving fast. And so I say to myself, oh my gosh, there's bush tits coming through. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's about, how many of them? Maybe 10 to 15. All right, so they go taking off into the bushes. They were moving so fast that I didn't really get a good look at them. But what I can do is I can write that I saw 10 to 15 bush tits. And this number will change as the hike goes on if I find even more. But something that's neat about bush tits at this time of year is when you see bush tits, there are all these other species that will be tagging along with them. And they fly in these flocks with the bush tits. So right now you find these mixed flocks of insectivores. And my dad taught me this trick. If you kind of hunker down next to the shrubbery and you go, psh, 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 psh. You try that. Everybody go, psh, 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 psh. Birders call this pishing. Psh, 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 psh. The birds, nobody's really sure why. The birds go like, oh, what's that? I'm gonna check it out. And they come popping out of the bush like popcorn. and you get a chance to get another look at the bush tits or wherever else is there. So we start, and up pops this little bird. And it's a small bird, brown back, white stripe over its eye, long tail that sticks up high, and very pale tummy. And what I do is when I see a bird like that and it pops up, I will start to say out loud whatever I observe about it, just like I just did, describing that bird. And what that does is it allows me to kind of keep some of those ideas in my head long enough for me to start to get it down on paper. And so what I will then do is lightly block in the shape of that bird. And I like just sort of using a light blue pencil. And so here I go, blocking in a little shape of this bird, and it's kind of hanging out on a little branch. And there's a little shape of this bird with that tail sticking up. Pretty sure it's a wren. So if I get a better look at it, I can start to draw more details on it. And so what I find is that if I start a drawing by just sort of lightly blocking in the shape, I can then draw right over that. And nobody will notice those original lines. And this, it is a wren. This is a bird that hangs out in the chaparral there, and it's called a Buick's wren. And they have a very kind of buzzy call, and during the springtime, they're going to be hanging out on their own. But right now, they're kind of pretending they're bush tits. And so I'll make just little notes, a little sketch of what I saw. This one had a very, very bold line above its eye. And I'll tend to do a lot of my drawing and sketching with a ballpoint pen. And the reason for that is because I can't erase it, it just sort of forces me to be just a little bit more kind of accepting of whatever I get. And so that I can then kind of get something down and then kind of go on to the next thing. Instead of kind of getting, if I've got an eraser, I keep going like, oh no, that wasn't right, that wasn't right. So for field stuff, a little pen often is a very useful tool. If that doesn't feel right to you, if you don't like working with a pen, there's no reason that you have to do that. So the wrens will often hold their tails up really, really tall and stiff. Here's my little wren friend. And I find that as I look at birds, as I study birds, the more that I draw them, it really forces me to notice the details of their bodies in a very, very different way. If you've ever been birding and a bird popped up and you go like, okay, that's that bird. And then you see the bird later on that day and you're like, you can't tell them apart. It's hard to remember what are the details of them. If you try just making sketches of what you see, the more you do that, the better and better it gets. Good things to look for are, for instance, the shape of the bill. So this is a long bill. And other features like this white eyebrow, tail straight up. You'll find that if you start to kind of annotate your sketches with these little lines saying details, and let's see, this one goes little burry noises. It's going so I'm going to give a little voice balloon here. There we go. So I've put a little observation down on my page. Some birds are more cooperative than others, and the pishing is a great trick because when they go away, you can often even call them back. Like, I would like to see the color of your back again. I really didn't get a good look at you, little bird. And so you can go boink, up pops the bird again, and you're good to go. So this is a very, very powerful way to become a better naturalist, somebody who kind of knows your local wildflowers and plants. If you have a hard time remembering those from one season to the next, consider starting to journal. And you'll see that whatever you put down paper, independent of whether or not it's a pretty picture or not, your memory of what you see is going to get so much better. And it's a really fun way to learn about nature. So on my website, I've got more little tricks and strategies for, fast drawing birds and things like that. A lot of it just comes from the more pencil miles you put in, the better it's going to come. But I also really strongly suggest that people get in the habit of adding written notes with these drawings. If it's just a drawing on its own, then it feels like an art project and there's a lot of pressure on it. But I'm going to say this is flying with bush tits in poison oak. Speaking of poison oak, if drawing birds feels just a little bit, too scary because like, oh no, these rascals move, then another thing that you can do is just at the start, focus on plants. At this time of year, poison oak has this really, the branches are bare, but there's this really distinctive kind of curve arc shape that the bare branches take. So I'm going to, partly as a public safety announcement here, but also just sort of show you how you kind of draw this. What I do is I start again with that little kind of light pencil drawing. And they'll have fairly thick stems that are smooth. And notice this curve. See how it kind of comes in here in this curve. Very often you'll see little bumps where leaves were attached, sticking out on the sides. So here's this little stick coming out in a little curve, and they're red-brown. So I'll put some red-brown on it. You want to do is get in the habit of being able to spot poison oak as you're walking along the trail at all times of the year. Kind of another kind of fun thing that you'll find right now is that very often they have berries on them right now. These little kind of white-gray berries. So I'm going to put in a little cluster of berries here. And some berries have been eaten off. The berries of these things, by the way, are wonderful wildlife food. How does poison oak get spread around so well? They've got these really delicious berries. There's a number of things like wren tits. It's quite likely that they're really pretty dependent on on the poison oak. So I'm going to give this a little bit of reddish gray brown. So I've taught my daughters to sort of see this shape, and then we jump away from it. Because you can get the poison oak just from those bare branches over there. So as we're going down this trail, I'm going to ask everybody just be really, really careful. You don't want to touch that. There we go. And the berries can be white, grayish, or sometimes a little bit of yellow-green. So put some of that in on those berries. And so I'm going to write that, hey, there's no leaves on poison oak right now. And so what I've got is, information that this is specific to this place. So here's what I'm seeing. Here is what is in bloom, or the status of the plants at this time of year. And as you do this, all those, the meditation practices try to get us just to focus on where you are and what is happening right at this moment, the whole idea of here and now. And that comes very much into the page of the nature journal. This poison oak at this time of the year, if you do a drawing of poison oak, it's saying something about where you are in the world, because poison oak it's got a limited range, and what it is doing says what time of year it is. And so poison oak is like this little calendar in a plant. And so I always love to have little sketches of poison oak. It also just reminds me of what it is doing at different times of the year. So we're going to make our way out to the point there, and there is the views along the trail are spectacular. And a lot of people get really intimidated by drawing landscape drawings. And the reason is that a landscape drawing, what we tend to do, since the landscape itself is big, people will make a great big landscape. And then what happens is your friends who are hiking along with you, they don't want to wait around while you are drawing this landscape, and it's going to take forever. And also, because it's really big, it requires you to put all this detailed information in there, so it takes a ton of time. So something that we do in nature journaling are what we call landscapitos. So it's the mini landscape. It's essentially a snapshot of something that you see. And so it's a super simplified view, but you'll find that these super simplified views do a ton to help you remember a place. So if you come around a corner and there's a little view, I'm going to do just a little landscape drawing, but instead of doing a big thing like this and getting lost in it and we'll be watching that forever, I'm going to do just a little landscapeito, and we're going to be done with a watercolor landscape in less than 5 minutes. So I'm going to make a little box just this big. Sometimes it's fun to have the parts of your journal, the things overlap each other. And it just sort of feels like the poison oak is then talking with this little landscape. So I'm looking out there, and there's a little kind of point of land that comes down into the water. And there are some other plants, some other rocks. We see far away, there's a distant shoreline. And so with this, initially what I do is I just sort of block in lightly, loosely, the big elements that I want to get. If you start drawing in part of something, what will happen is you'll take the part that you're the most interested in and you'll make it too big, and then the whole landscape ends up being really big. So initially, if you just sort of frame in a little box and put in like, okay, there's going to be a cliff that comes in generally in this area before I get into any detail in it. There'll be another cliff coming along here, another pile of rocks sticking out, some birds on them. You are going to be able to finish this really quickly. So how much of my 5 minutes have I used up? Part of that was just me yapping. Well, let's just sort of see how really you can get away with doing these things really quickly. So here is a place where the water kind of comes down there are some cliffs, and there are some trees that stick up here. So look, if I'm doing this small, I can handle these distant trees just by going like this. Here's some of the treetops. And there's some trees. And I have a really cool rock that sticks out into the water. And I don't want to get lost in all the little details. So there's a bump right here. I want to just get that basic shape down. And if I can do that, then that's going to be good enough. All right, so here is a distant cliff. In front of me, I have some rocks that have some birds on them. So I'm just putting in a little shape there. A line kind of going out into the water here. A couple flat lines in the water makes this water surface, people then read that as being flat. And up close to me, there are some Monterey cypress in the foreground. And in the very, very background, there is more of the Monterey Bay, sort of sticking out there. And so I am going to just sort of, that's going to be there. Notice I'm now pressing a little bit more lightly with my ballpoint pen, and it makes this light. And so just like that, I have a little snapshot of what's going on out there. And I can leave it, if I choose to, as a little pen and ink drawing. It's also really easy on a small landscape like this with a few strokes to turn this into a painting. So look at this. So here is some blue in the sky, and it's going to get lighter down towards the horizon. The water is darker than the sky, and a little bit of green, a little bit of blue. Maybe need a little bit more green in there. And then there is a distant part of the Monterey Peninsula. I'm just going to put in a little coat of gray in for that. And I'm going to use a slightly darker value as I get up into these cliffs here in front of me. And they have, so I'm going to be putting in some darker shadows on them. And I also want to leave part of them white because of those kind of white pale cliffs. So just a higher contrast in those areas. And a little bit into these rocks that are in front of us here. Make it dark along the base of them where the water hits. And the final little thing, give them just a little bit of, here are these plants that are in the foreground that I'm looking past. And I'm not going to stick that same color into those background ones there. I'm going to change that background one to sort of a bluish, paler bluish green. So it doesn't quite jump out. The really intense colors are for up close to me. And there's a little, just a little landscape drawing. So things like that, you can finish those quickly. And that kind of just gives you a sense of the place you're in. Is going to help you remember that day. Wanted to make that just a little bit more contrasty in the back to have that cliff face stick out. All right. I continue walking along, and as I do, so part of my process as a naturalist is I'm looking around and I'm making observations. I'm noticing things, I'm noticing things, I'm noticing things. So those observations I put down in my journal. For instance, it is now, this was started off at 8:30. And here by 9:30, sky has cleared. So there's another observation. I'm thinking about like how much of the day down here is foggy. And so anytime I get a question, what I do is I write those questions down in the journal as well. So I say, how much of the month is fogged in? And now I'm thinking like, wouldn't it be neat to sort of see for the full year, like where's the fog? What does that look like, right? Any question that you get, write those in your journal. I'm wondering like, who eats the poison oak? Who eats poison oak? Who eats these berries? When you get a question that you really like, it helps to kind of put a big question mark next to that. What you're doing is you're saying to your brain, hey, brain, this is kind of cool. Spend a little bit more time kind of thinking about this or come back to this later. Just putting in that, that big question mark is enough to get your brain to pause on that a little bit more. Anytime in the future that you get some information that kind of bears on that question, because you kind of were a little bit more intentional about kind of calling out this little wonder, this little mystery, you'll remember like, oh yeah, that's that thing that I was wondering about. And because you did that, you'll then kind of lean into that new moment and you'll remember this new bit of information. So by being intentional about noticing when you get a good question that you want to follow up on, just give those a little bit more love. And those will stick with you. So finally, we get out to the point, and this is the part that everybody's been looking for. There is, how cute, an otter down in the water below you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest that first we're going to just look at it. And so out there, there's some kelp. There's some kelp. So I'm going to draw a little box here, a little kind of frame here. And I look out into the kelp and there's a little otter out there. It's got some of the kelp over it. And maybe there's another one near it. All right, there's a couple of otters out there. So I'm going to draw in those two otters. There we go. And if you say like, but those don't really look like two otters out there. That's okay. You know how you can make them look like two otters even more? Is you just write next to this box, two otters in kelp. And now what happens is you've planted the suggestion that these are otters, and anybody who looks at this, they're going to go like, oh, look at that, two otters. Another thing that you can do that's really fun is to just draw things at different scales, right? So question, are they free from sharks here? It seems to me that hanging out like that, they would just be a target. So why aren't they in somebody's belly? That's interesting. So what is the relationship between otters and great white sharks? How do great white sharks affect Otters. I don't know. So again, you want to intentionally write your questions. Some of these questions that you ask down the line, you're going to come up with answers to these. Other questions that you ask, well, those are, you don't have to answer one of your questions to have it then stimulate your thinking on to the next question. So you're going to, ideally, in one hike, you're going to and ask more questions than you can answer in that week. So I'm now going to just do a little close-up of that otter because you brought your binoculars with you. And you see that sticking the head is up, and then the belly sticks down from that, and then the little otter feetsies stick up there. All right. And I'll show you a couple of little tricks to handling drawing this otter. Let me just zoom in on this a little bit because if you live in the Monterey area, you love you some otters, and you want to be able to get your otter on. So here is just a thought about doing that. So one is I'm going to have kind of a ball for the head, and I'm going to draw a line around the middle of the head, and that's going to be the middle of its head. So the eyes are going to be symmetrical on either side of that, and the nose is going to be symmetrical across that. The ears, if I can see them, are going to be symmetrical across that. So I've just got a few kind of guidelines in here. Otters, for the nose, they've got a really, really big nose that is kind of a diamond-shaped thing. And their eyes are small. So I'm going to have a small eye here, the other eye right there on the side. If I have one ear that's kind of sticking up back this way, my other otter ear is going to be right back here. So see how those are on lines. By having the nose along the same line as the eyes, along the same line as the ears, that is going to help kind of keep those little ottery bits symmetrical. Here's my little otter body. You've got those cute little paws that stick up, and you're not going to be able to see fingers on those, so don't draw any in. They've got two little otter hands sticking up there. And then otter tummies. And generally, when you're looking at those little otter feet, it's hard to see, again, the details. You'll kind of get a general shape of something. But if there's details that you can't see, then don't worry about it. Don't put those in. And lastly, if you're close to the water line looking out at the otter, you'll see the water line being flat across it like this. But if you're up on the cliffs looking down, then what you'll get is this edge being more rounded because you're up above it looking down. With my ballpoint pen, I usually put in kind of quick hatching lines just to add in some value. And doing that allows me to show that the head of this older otter is pale. So it's just a quick little ottery moment. For drawing the water around it, just sort of a hint of some lines in the water, help people sort of see that as a flat surface. And if you want to, you can draw little pieces of kelp sticking up. Next to our friendly otter. Oh yeah, this guy had that the kelp wrapped over its tummy, didn't it? So we're gonna just put a little amount of kelp. The little trick of wrapping yourself up in the kelp is such a kind of cool otter stunt. You can take a nap without floating somewhere you don't want to float. So there is enlargement. So something I really recommend people often do in their journals is draw things at different scales. So sometimes here, life size, far away, zoomed in a little bit more, zoom out for another landscape. When you're bopping around to all those different scales, you will notice different sorts of things. So there I have questions. Like, are the two otters a mated pair? So very often when you ask one question, that will stimulate you to ask another question. So now I'm wondering, are they a mated pair? What is the otter pair bond like? Do they mate for life? Season? Just a date? Right? So you can also get your thinking down on paper. The idea of this, again, is that the journal is this is your brain on paper. And what we do is we try to get ourselves to observe richly and deeply, to wonder about what we see, and make connections with the things that are out here. The more that we do this, the more that we practice it, the better we get at being present in a place and learning its cycles and learning its seasons. The questions we write down often prompt us to kind of then do some research on that in a way that's different than if we just sort of thought it in our head. And so that is kind of what this process can look like. Why not? I'll just add a little bit of watercolor to my little otter friend. The brush that I'm using is a what's called a water brush. And it's a neat little brush that has the water in the handle of the brush. So if you do a lot of stuff in the field, you're going to find that these are really handy. You just refill it by opening it up and pouring in. A little bit of water. I just wanted to get some dark around that little dude's head, because then that pale head just shows up a little bit better. And here's my little dark otter body. And I'll leave some places on the belly here to be kind of some reflected light. And kind of wet otterness. There we go. That's fun. I really missed Point Lobos. This call is being made from up in San Mateo, and it's Lobos is one of those places on this planet that is always just sort of stuck in my head. Of every time I'm out there, there's wonder. There's something amazing going on, and so beautiful to kind of see that in all of its seasons. And the purpose of making a nature journal is not about pretty pictures. Pictures are a tool in service of paying attention. And if we treat them kind of as a fetish, where the goal is to make a picture, then if you get a pretty picture, you're like, oh, yeah, I did. But if you don't like the way the picture came out, you beat yourself up. You're like, no, that's not what I want. No, it doesn't look like that. But if you just use it to think about, like, oh, I'm noticing something and I want to get that observation down. And if you don't like it, if it's not clear enough from your picture, you can always annotate those and sort of say pale head. Or wiggling paws. Wiggling paws. Is it eating? So that is kind of what nature journaling can look like. Very often when I get back from a hike, I'll take a look at it again, and I'll kind of look over the big thing and sort of see, are there any questions that I asked? Are there any observations that I made that are really, really interesting that I want to remember, right? So for instance, in this one, let's say I want to say, like, I really want to remember that in this season, the poison oak is bare, but there still are berries visible on it. Well, what I do is there's my pen. I will draw a star or an exclamation point, or sometimes I'll draw in googly eyes looking over at the poison oak sprout. Like, oh, look at that. Saying, here's an observation that I really want to remember. Here's a question that I really want to remember. Right? And that reinforces those ideas. Last little naturalist trick that I want to share with you is what I call the "it reminds me of." And this is a way of kind of harnessing some real creative thinking as part of your nature exploration process. And the way that works is, let's say I'm looking at these poison oak seeds. They've got these little ridges along them. And what I do is I'll say, like, what does this reminds me of? So I'll go IRMO. It reminds me of. And they remind me of little pumpkins. Right? Of glass beads. Right? And they remind me of one of those. They remind me of my grandmother's candy jar. She always had this candy jar, and there are these sort of strange little candies in there that they were probably only eaten when my brother and I came to visit, which means that they're really pretty stale, but they would be there in that candy jar, and she would let you take them. which was special. But they had these ridges on them, and there's some kind of sweet thing, sort of more gushy inside them and a hard outside. Those kind of remind me of this. You know, it's interesting. I haven't thought about that grandma's candy jar for years and years and years. But when you intentionally kind of do, and it reminds me of, it'll take you all sorts of interesting places. Like this one, little pumpkins. These have ridges along the side of them, like pumpkins. So if you look at it from the end, kind of like that. So the what is the purpose of those ridges in pumpkins? What is the function of those in these? Is there a similar function? So sometimes it reminds me of, just sort of takes you in this sort of playful direction. And I'm thinking about grandma's candy. Sometimes it's, you know, I'm thinking more kind of structure. Is this structure, is there a common ancestry? Is there a common function with those? Is that, why do those sort of have a similar shape? So whatever it is that you can make a kind of connection with, let yourself do that. And then nature journaling in a place is going to do three things. It's going to improve your observation skills. It's going to enhance your curiosity. So when you are curious about something, your brain actually starts working better. The dopamine that gets released in curiosity, curiosity is that feeling of being curious about something is actually a slosh of dopamine in your brain. It helps you think better and stick with something longer than you otherwise would. And so it enhances your observation, your ability to notice things. It enhances your curiosity and therefore your memory. When you're curious about things, you remember things better. And the last little thing is to intentionally, you can practice creative thinking. So creativity is your brain's ability to make useful connections between seemingly unrelated things. And so here, kind of connecting these seeds with pumpkins, you know, maybe there's something to that. But even if there isn't, just the practice of looking for connections, and dropping those in is going to help my brain practice making connections. And that on its own is a really valuable thing. So what I'd like to do now is just, before we open this up to questions, and I want to encourage you to sort of think for a moment about this process. If you have questions that you'd like to ask me about either logistics of how do you do this or that, or more philosophical thoughts, like this reminds you of something else. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What does this remind you of as you look at this process? Before we do that, I just wanted to just pull out an old journal here and just show you that, you know, every page is a different sort of a thing. And depending on where you are and what you're doing, you know, journal pages are going to look really, really different. So for instance, this is, these are diagrams of standing waves in a river. So the standing waves had these little shark fins on them. These were standing waves in a sandy, shallow creek. And that is interesting. So if I find a critter, I kind of can drop into exploring that critter. Here is studies of a burrowing owl that wasn't really letting me observe it very well, so it's mostly hidden. Sometimes it's landscapes, landscape ethos that will take me back to a place. This is a diagram of rings, patterns of different sorts of plants that were out in rings at different distances from a tree in a grassy field. So you can see, depending on what I'm looking at, how I'm recording that in my journal, over time, I develop more and more strategies that help me be able to record that. So for instance, here's taking a look at another, this is an oak tree that had a ring of fiddleneck flowers around it and popcorn flowers next to that. So here's, for the tree, I just drew this sort of stylized thing and made this diagram showing that the fiddleneck was growing in a ring around the outside of this tree. This is a diagram of a rock outcrop in this line of rocks going down this little gully. And my guess is that these were connected by some outcrop underneath the ground that kind of came in like this. So you see, what I'm doing here is training myself to envision what I can't see. If I see a pattern on the surface, I'm then turning that around and sort of diagramming what that would look like. So this is a drawing of mudflats showing that different birds will hang out at different places in the water. The stilts, which have really long legs, way out in the water. The dowitchers with shorter legs right at the water's edge. And the sandpipers with the shortest legs of all up on the mudflats. So you see, it doesn't have to be a pretty picture. It can be just a little diagram of what I'm seeing. And the more you do this, the more kind of tools or ways of recording information you are going to develop. And so by doing that, you're developing ways of thinking visually. And that really can enhance your experience as a naturalist, as a scientist, as an observer. And it's a lot of fun.